Gentlemen, ladies, everything in between, welcome back to the shop. What we're going to be looking at here today is the Browning Automatic 5, also the Auto 5 or A5 if it's well known. It's a pretty iconic shotgun for the United States, actually a lot of the world too. They're used all over the place, the British Empire, all over Europe mostly. They think there was a few South American places that it was not manufactured but distributed, sold, and used. The nomenclature on it as a automatic 5 stood for automatic shotgun, obviously, and then it would hold 5 rounds, 4 in the tube, 1 in the magazine. This was the very first design and produced automatic shotgun ever. John Browning designed it in 1898, I think, got a patent for it in 1900. It was produced all the way up until 1998. So almost 100 years. It's well known as the humpback, as you can see, because unlike any of the other guns, the action goes straight back and then drops off here, giving it that pretty iconic look. Originally, Browning took this thing to Winchester because they made a lot of his designs, or whatever, he sold the designs to them, and they manufactured them. They weren't interested. There were some terms and agreements they couldn't come together on. John Browning considered this probably his best design ever. I'm trying to remember exactly how he was created. It was basically his most pride achievement was designing this gun here. But Winchester turned it down, so he took it to Remington, the design, and in the middle of all of that, the president of Remington had a heart attack and died, so Browning had to look somewhere else. Sorry, still trying to get some juice in me here. Then he went to FN. FN had been building some stuff, including some of his pistols. Went to FN Fabrique Nationale Herstal in Belgium. And they took his design and went ahead and started producing it for him, starting in 1902, I think, 1902, 1903. Later on down the road, he actually got a license, licensed it to Remington. Remington created the Model 11, which was built till 1947. Yeah, I think it's somewhere around there. It was just after World War II. But both the Auto 5 and the Remington Model 11 were used in the military. They saw service from World War I. It's a little Vietnam era. The Remington Model 11 lacks, for the most part, it's identical, except it lacks the magazine cutoff here. Oddly enough, the Remington Model 11 is also the gun that Kurt Cobain shot himself with, if memory serves correctly. These guns came, at least the Brownings came in 12, 20, and 16 gauge. The 16 gauges, I think, in the late 70s to the late 80s, about a decade that they didn't make them at 16 gauge. It just wasn't real popular anymore, which is really sad. I love 16 gauge. That's my dove killing gun of choice, the 16 gauge. I have 3 different guns in that chambered for 16. I've got an 870. A Savage 775A, which is an alloy receiver, and it's the 775A is almost a direct copy of the A5. It was Browning licensed that to Savage to build them, and they had other models too. I think starting with their 720, and that was built for about 20 years, from like 1930 to 1950. There was a 745, which was an alloy receiver that was kind of in the same era. I think it was like the 40s or something, but it was an aluminum alloy receiver, made it a little bit more lightweight. Later on, Remington used the same design in partial on the 1148, Model 1148, which obviously at 1947 or whatever it was, the end of the production 11, they created the 1148, which is just a modified version. But these guns, I mean, just thousands and thousands of them built in every shape, form, or whatever else. They had different grades of them. This particular one is a vent rib. Came into the shop with some spring issues on the trigger group. Actually, I had a broken safety spring, but originally brought it in because he said that He thought it was broken. What it was, he had somebody clean it. When they put it back together, they assembled it wrong, which is not difficult to do with these guns. They're pretty intricate on the inside, and they have to go together a pretty specific way. But they're not they're not complicated, but they are complex in design. You just need to pay attention. Once you've been in and out of one several times, I've rebuilt several of these pretty much from the ground up. That's my third 16 gauge that I have. I bought off a guy. It was a 53 made Belgian 16 gauge. This is before they called them Sweet 16s. That wasn't until I think the early to mid 60s that they called them Sweet 16s. Before that, they were just a 16 gauge A5. But the one that I got, man, the stocks were all cracked to hell. They were used, so I had to throw them away and put new wood on them. Had to fit new fore-end, new stock. Needed to be blued. The barrel was tweaked a little bit. It wasn't a vent rib, so I could actually put it in the barrel bender, and I could bend it out, and then I had to pull some dents out of the barrel, re-blue the whole thing, put it back, so it looks all fancy and new. But because it is a refinished gun, doesn't have original wood or anything like that, it's not worth as much as something like this that's in pretty much original shape. This one's a 12 gauge. The 16 gauges and the 20 gauges will demand higher prices collector value wise, but there are some 12 gauge versions that are still worth quite a bit. The Belgian made ones are the most desirable. I think in the middle of the 70s somewhere is when Browning moved the production to Japan with a company called Moroku, and they were building for a long time. Moroku was building their lever actions and their bolt actions and their shotguns, pumps, autoloaders. I mean, just about everything. A lot of Browning and Winchester stuff was built there in Japan. Like I said, 1999 they ceased production on this. FN, I think 99-2000 did a couple of commemorative versions. I think that's only because they probably had some spare parts laying around, and they might as well, you know, get the most out of their dollar if they're going to do something like that. Anyways, yammering enough about this thing. These guns are amazing. They have a lot of history, but they're a lot of fun too. It is a what they call a long recoil operation, which means that the barrel, and actually when I pull the springs out I'll show you, but the barrel and everything recoils with the whole gun back, and then the action and the barrel recoil together. Then the barrel comes sliding back forward out of the action, and the shell ejects, and then the bolt comes forward and chambers a new round. So it is a recoil operated gun. They did, I think in 2014, I think it was, that they re-released the Browning A5. I've also got one of those in the shop at Happenstances, but they are nowhere near the design of the original A5. There's some kind of bastardized Benelli type action, recoil action, so everything happens back here. The barrel is fixed. It is still recoil operated, but it's not this. It's only exterior does it have the looks, the humpback, and that's where the similarities end. But anyways, we'll move on here. Just like any other shotgun, you know, you're going to pull your magazine cap off here. This gun, it does help to compress the barrel a little bit or hold it down, because all that spring pressure is pushing forward on here. So it makes this end cap a little bit stiff pulling off. I'm going to do that. Just get it out of the camera for a second so I can get this thing off and not fight that spring. Okay, here we go. And that's what I'm talking about. That thing just jumps right out of there like that. So that pressure's fighting on your end cap. From here, you can take your stock off. The only thing that stops the forward motion of this barrel against this big ass spring, this recoil spring for the barrel, is the fore end itself. So the front, the barrel lug here, actually hits the wood, and that's what stops. So a lot of these things have split wood on them, and let's see if I can get you can see all that up here where it actually makes contact with this wood. And a lot of times what ends up happening is this thing splits right here, or it's just so battered that you have to replace this wood. Now, there are some tricks that I've seen. I've seen people making PVC bushings and cutting a whole bunch of this wood back here and making a PVC bushing and epoxying it in, so that you can retain the original wood, but you have it repaired, and then that PVC or you can use nylon or Delron or whatever else, but it's a little more forgiving. You know, it'll take a little bit more punishment than the wood, and it keeps from cracking the wood. There's a couple of things you can do like that. Anyways, there's a detent and ball in here, and this little brass escutcheon right there. This one's old and probably needs to be cleaned up real good. But that brass escutcheon holds in a just a little pin, and that's what your cap rides against. It's what detents it in those little grooves there. So barrel will just slide off. And like I said, this one's a vent rib. This guy's got a cute little brass flathead screw for a front bead, so that's kind of a home fix jobby there. Pretty cool. I'll set this over here. Fixed choke gun on this particular model here. We're going to start getting into the action, some way things work here. This brass ring and its collar, and this little ring here is kind of it acts as a brake to help slow down the recoil impulse of that barrel going back, so it doesn't just bash into the frame and just completely destroy the frame. And what you'll see is that there is a slight bevel. Let's see if we can get that in the camera there somewhere. There, it's beveled here on this brass end, and there's a corresponding bevel on that barrel lug, so when it hits and that barrel recoils, it actually pinches this down like so, and that causes it to drag down this mag tube like a brake. And the other thing that there is that it's basically adjustable for the type of load you're going to run. The heavier recoiling loads, this steel ring here has a bevel on it as well. And what you would do if you're running the heavier recoiling loads, you stick your spring on, you stick this steel ring here, and then you put your brass ring over it. And now you've got two bevel pieces, wedges, that are compressing this, so it acts like it breaks even harder because it's now being compressed even harder, and it helps slow down that recoil impulse. So it's not just the big spring here and the spring in the back here that will take apart, but that will help do it. If you're running lighter dove loads, things like that, what you would do is you take that bevel action facing towards the action, and that would go on first, and then your spring would go on behind it, and the same thing, that bevel end faces to the front of the mag tube there, and that runs for lighter loads. Parts for these things are all kinds of available. They're not rare by any means. Like I said, they've been around, you know, almost 100 years of production, so there's quite a few parts available for the gun. Tons and tons of screws on these things that go in certain places in certain ways. The stock is held on by this screw here, kind of like their lever, the end of the Winchester lever actions and stuff. Is it's literally just these two. You know, there's a screw here that prevents this one from backing out. So we go into there. These Brownings, it's pretty imperative that, you know, I mentioned before about using the right size screwdrivers, and this thing's old and it's been come apart from original quite a few times, because you can just see how rolled over and screwed up all of these screws are. Man, they're just boogered to shit, and that's what happens when you use incorrect style screwdrivers. So make sure that you've got the right stuff. That little screw is going to come out just like so, and then you're going to get this big one here. Comes out. You pull the stock off here, and this one came off. It's pretty loose. It's probably been on and off a couple of times. Typically they're real tight, and what you end up having to do is take your hand on the bottom and swing and smack it right here on the wrist, and pop it off. And sometimes it's real tight, or sometimes you have to come up top here and hit and grab right here so it'll come off. Don't try and just, you know, beat it off with it. You end up dinging or damaging the stock and causing all kinds of problems. The next kind of obvious thing here is your magazine spring and follower retainer, and these things can be a royal pain in the ass, but they come out just like any other shotgun. Depending on how old it is whether or not it's plastic or steel. So that came out there. Again, it's like any other shotgun, hold on to it because that spring's going to want to come springing out of there pretty quick. There. Magazine follower. It's not uncommon for these followers to get stuck here on this lip. It's not that big of a deal. I'll show you how to get that out of there here in a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here. Let's take this little guy out. There's a little retainer on the back here for the action spring, and that's actually what drives the bolt back and forth in the gun. There's a spring that comes down through the tail end of this receiver, and it's got a little plug right here, and there it comes. Sometimes that pin comes out real super easy, and sometimes it's rusted in, but it just goes through that little hole there in that retainer on the back end of that spring, and it slides in with that corresponding hole, and it's just there to retain it. But when they're that loose and you start wiggling, obviously they come springing out. There's another little kind of a follower on this end thing. They usually stick together pretty well, so you may or may not lose a part there. But once that tension's off, it makes it a lot easier for you to be able to move the bolt and stuff back and forth. Now we can pull the trigger group out. Kind of the same thing. It's got 4 screws, but 2 of those are just screws that retain another screw. They're just there to keep other screws from turning and spinning out during operation. So we'll pull those out real quick. And then we'll pull the actual screws. And some of these guns, actually on this one here, one of these isn't really even a screw on some models. I can't remember if it's all of them or just some of them. So that big one there, but some of them are just a pin with a screw head in them. I think this gun actually has, it's a screw. But some of these A5s, and their cousins, the Savages and the Remington. I don't know about the Model 11s, but I'm pretty sure the Savages are this way. So that one's got an actual screw. But some of these, there's no threads on it. It's just a pin that goes through the whole receiver and trigger group and everything else. Comes out, and the only thing that holds that in is that little retaining screw. But the way that those fit, I don't know if you can see in the camera here, but see how there's that little half moon cutout on that screw there? Focus, you fuck. That's, you know, you align that in the receiver there, and then that other little screw sits in there, and that's what retains and keeps it from spinning. So as long as this little guy is tight, this will never come out, regardless of how tight it is. You got your trigger group here. That spring there, there's several different ways that this ends up inside of the gun. Or rather I should say, sometimes it's the pin on the trigger group here, and a lot of the older models there was a pin inside the receiver itself that you had to put this on before the trigger group sits back down inside of there. And it operates your carrier, and all that here is operated by that spring. And when I go to put it back together, I'll kind of show you how all that works there. But this little guy, you know, will likely fall out when you pull this out. There's nothing really retaining it. If it's in here inside the receiver, you'll have to reach in there and pull it out. It won't just fall out most of the time. This trigger group is pretty straightforward. It can be a little bit of a pain in the butt, but typically you'll start with this is the disconnector. So when the gun's on fire and you go to pull on the trigger, it doesn't allow the trigger to move at all. And then, or not disconnector, but it's a safety. But when the bolt comes forward, it hits that little guy, and pulls it out of the way and allows the trigger to move so the hammer can fall, right? The disconnector is actually on the back there. Yeah, it jumps. Damn it. We're in safe. And then even if it's not on safe, if that bolt isn't all the way in battery, everything isn't forward far enough, it won't work. That rides on a little pin here. That's actually part of this trigger group. You can, I mean, no, none of this one. It must be the newer model. It's got a what would you call it? Knurled pin. So it actually, when it's pushed in here, it's really hard to get out. But you don't need to drive this pin out. What you can do is get under there, maybe with a little tiny flat blade, if you can find one, is the easiest, or a pick. Sometimes I can get it with this pick, sometimes I can't. But it's just a little detent and spring underneath there. And if you push it out of the way, be careful because this thing will come flying. You just push that down and that just slides off of that pin. And you got that little ball, or it's not even a detent ball, it's an actual detent little pin, spring, that's all that's in there. And what keeps that from sliding off during operation is that there's a square, a notch cut out in the bottom of this, and that detent rides in there, so this thing can't come out of there. And since I've already started taking the trigger group apart, we're going to go ahead and finish taking it apart. For the, yeah, fuck it. So, hammer will come forward. You got a big giant flat spring back here. And this screw, this other screw that's on the bottom side there, is what holds that main spring in. The hammer spring. That comes out of there. And what it is this spring is actually threaded, and so that screw threads directly into that spring. That's just a through hole in here. But what it does retain is this hole here. This is another flat spring under here. You can see the edge, but that little flat spring is your trigger return spring. I don't know if you can see those two. Let's see if we can get the light in there just right. See how there's like 3 legs in there? It looks almost like a sear spring on a 1911. But that centerpiece right here is actually what holds there's a detent ball under there. And that's what makes the safety operate, right? There's a detent ball, and that spring holds the detent ball down, so that goes back and forth. The other 2 legs of this thing are what are your trigger return springs. So there's a leg for each side of the trigger, and you can see where it rides right there. See how it rides in there on each side of it? And that's your trigger return spring. It's only lined up with this hole here, but this little narrow pin's what actually keeps it down, keeps spring pressure on it. There's a pin here, that's all that holds the trigger in place. You can pull the trigger out first and then knock that pin out, and then the spring comes out. Be careful because there is a detent ball underneath here, and that's for the safety. Once that detent ball is out of the way, the safety will fall out. Your hammer is just in there by a pin. You can see it moves pretty easy. That pin's not in there real super tight, so hell, it may even fall out on you. But that's really all there is to it. I really don't want to take it apart anymore because this stuff's kind of a pain in the ass to get back together. But we're going to set all that over here. Man, more go juice. The next thing we're doing is we're going to pull this carrier out of here, and it, like the other stuff, has a retaining screw on both sides. So we're going to pull these retaining screws out. And they're real short, just like the other ones. Another interesting fact too is that if I remember correctly, these screws are actually clocked, or what they call clocked, for a specific part of the receiver, so that when you put this back together, the screws pretty much face all the same direction. And people over the years, taking them apart and putting them back together, generally what happens is those screws don't go back in the same hole because they're all the same. If you look at all these things here, they're the same thread pattern, pitch, size, and everything else. So you got 5 or 6 of those, and they just never go back into the same holes. So you could sit here and spend time and figure out which one they go into so that all your screws line up in the same direction, whatever else. And unless you're just a real stickler for it, it's not worth it. This big giant screw here comes out. Big screw, it's got threads. There's one leg your follower, but it's got kind of a pin on there, and that's what holds that carrier in, or what the carrier rides on. So there's not the screw doesn't go all the way through, there's just one on each side. There, and there's the other part of your carrier. As the bolt comes back, this gets kicked, throws the shell up. It's nice and gooey. We got that guy come out. Here, this is a magazine disconnect, is what this is here. So what happens is this: the magazine's open, so as the gun fires, it's cycling rounds out of the magazine. But what you can do is, if you want to change the type of ammunition you're using, so you're going from a different type of shot. So if you want to go from a number 4 to a number 2, or let's say that you're out there shooting dove and you're running 8s and 9s, you want to go down to like a 7.5, a 7, you can flip that, and what it does is it physically blocks rounds from coming out of the magazine. Here, you see that little guy right there. If you flip that back the other way, you can see that moving. Well, that's what stops that. What happens is the gun will fire, and it'll lock up open after firing and ejecting that shell, and you can drop another shell into the chamber and then send the bolt home. And you can keep single feeding rounds into it like that. So forward, it'll run out of the magazine, and when you flip it back, it blocks the magazine. And it's simple enough. It's just a screw, and this is a little flat spring here. And you can see somebody else has been inside of this thing and just boogered the shit out of that screw. Yeah, somebody really munched that thing up. Let's go back focus, you. Come on. I need to come over here in the light. Nope, not out of film. There we go. Whatever, you can see it's pretty trashed. But that spring, it's just kind of a flat spring, and that'll just kind of slide right off of there. No big deal. I'll put it over here next to that screw that was all beat to shit. That ain't it. That's my main spring screw. Where'd that fucker go? Which one of you? That's how bad it is. You can't even tell which one of these things. There it is. Bang! That also retains, if I remember correctly, retains the mag tube. It actually screws into the mag tube to, there's a dimple on it. You know, see how there's that area without threads on it on this screw. Pokes into the mag tube, and that's what keeps it from backing out. These things are usually in here really, really tight. So don't mess with pulling those things out, man. You end up stripping something or whatever else. Now it's just a matter of getting the little screws out of here. So there's 3 little screws in here, and they're super tiny flat blade screws. I'm going to come back to these screws here in a little bit, man. I think they have been replaced at some point in their lives with some sort of set screw. Those do not look factory at all, because I think they're a hex head, or like an Allen key. They're not flat heads, and they're supposed to be itty bitty little flat heads. So I think I'm gonna have to come back to those here in a second, figure out what the fuck. Here, so the bolt and carrier and all this other stuff. This stuff comes out here kind of goofy. This charging handle, you have to have this link here. Has to be pushed up out of the way for this charging handle to kind of let go of the bolt and all that. But first, if you see what we got on this side here is a hole. That hole is not for lubrication. And that's so you can align this pin that holds some of these locking parts up on the inside here, and their spring holds them in. And that's what's stopping this bolt from coming out the front end. So if you line it up there, and you can see that pin in there, that little guy right there, you have to line up in that little notch. Well, when you do that, on the opposite side, on the receiver here, is that little pin. So that's where you can take your punch, stick it in that hole there. Let's get one that's actually going to fit. Oh, guy. Nope. Too big. How about you? You gonna fit in there? Yeah, that'll work. And drive that pin out the other side like so. Those are typically pretty tight. There we go. So, pin came out, and then your locking tab there, and inside you have that spring, the coil spring in there, goes underneath there. And now what you can do is that even if you somehow got that back down there so the charging handle didn't come out, what all you have to do is lift up on this guy here, and you can see that charging handle, how it gets locked in there, and you lift this up out of the way, and that charging handle will slide back out from underneath it, and now you can just push that bolt and everything in the carrier, actually it's kind of the bolt and locking thing, out the front, and then the charging handle itself you can just pull back out through here. And that's pretty much the internals, except I'm going to have to go back to these here on this gun. I don't know what the deal is. I put some goo in there to try and blow out all the dirt and gunk, but it looks as though somebody has replaced those. But typically those are really, really tiny flathead screws that you have to get in there and be very careful with. These are, like this here is not only a shell stop, but it's also your bolt release when it gets locked back. So as the thing cycles, it acts as a bolt release and a shell stop. And this guy to some extent too works that way. But those what's hold all these things in here. So behind here, is a big coil spring, and the same thing in here. Back right here, there's a big coil spring. But yeah, that other shell stop in here. So, anyways, those unscrew, and then this just kind of they'll pop out of the way there. They're a pain in the butt to put back in anyways, but if I could get them out, I would show you. I really am not sure what's going on there. There's some replacement parts clearly, and again, I think they're set screws or something holding a pin in would be my guess, because those screws are almost this long, almost completely the width here. Those skinny little flathead screws, and they're threaded at the top end here, and it's just a pin, the rest of it, that goes through there. But I think in this case what they've done is replace those. They probably got boogered up somehow. This gun's been apart many times, clearly. That they probably dropped a pin in that fit the hole like it's supposed to, and then ran a set screw down on top of it to keep the pin from coming back out. So yeah, it's quite interesting. Anyways, that's all there is to that disassembly there. On the receiver, I think we've still got the bolt and carrier. So locking block comes in and out here like that. You have two. For the same reason, these things, extractors and ejectors, are always a pain in the ass to get in and out, so I'm not going to drive these things out. Two pins, extractors and ejectors, coil springs behind them. They come out in the top. This thing is just dirty as all hell. Look at that. Big pin here holds in your firing pin. So that guy would come out. I don't see how easy he wants to push up. Not very. They generally don't. These things are all in here super tight on all these pins, and can do some. It's not worth nailing them out just for the sake of the video, but you just know that they're in there tight. So when you drift them out, you're gonna have to beat the crap out of them. There's kind of a crescent shaped U in here, and that's really what retains this. The firing pin holds it in because obviously the link is in there with its pin, but to get that out you have to knock this pin out, pull the firing pin out, this will come out, and there's a pin on the between the link and the actual locking block itself. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward kind of stuff. You'll see how it comes apart. It's just they're in there super tight, and I don't want to wash them out or have risk allowing them to get damaged if they fall out or whatever else. They're pretty tight for a reason. But that's really all there is to this thing. I know I've said that a couple of times, but that's it. There's a lot of complexities, and it looks like a lot of parts, but they're just not that complicated. There's screws that hold the butt pad in, just like any other shotgun. You just don't have to do anything in the back, and there, obviously, you saw the screw come out, so there's no bolt back here you have to pull out to get the stocks out. As I put together, I'll try and show you some things to look at that are commonly broken parts in it, that wear out a lot and things like that. This is something I haven't encountered before, and like I said, I believe what has been done here is that there's some sort of Allen head screw. I don't know if they're metric or standard or what. I haven't gotten that far into it yet. That's holding in just pins. I'm gonna have to. I don't know if I'm even the bother figured out. I fixed what the guy needed fixing. Don't need to really pull them out. There's nothing back there broke, so I'm not going to get into it. I'm afraid I might break it if I do. But it's clearly been repaired and replaced with something. We'll figure it out. You know, I'll go through some things that are pretty common to break.